Yes, exactly. Hi, Jody. Hi, Anne. Anne's here too. Great.
Yeah, we have a lovely group already. I think we will continue to grow. I'm cognizant of time and I don't want to eat into your time, Brooke, of speaking. So I'm going to do my quick Zoom tutorial for everybody who's here on time, and then I'll turn it over to you. So welcome everyone to our first Culture and Coffee Break, our second week of virtual programs. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces, but then also some new ones for me, at least. I'm Abby King. I'm here as your kind of IT Zoom support today. So I'm gonna really quickly just go over some Zoom basics. I know many of us know a lot about Zoom now, which is our new reality. But for those of you who this might be your first time, I want to make sure that you know all the capabilities that we have here. And the first thing is that Zoom basically has two ways that you can see people. So your default is called speaker view. So if I'm a big giant head at the bottom of your screen, that means you're on speaker view. We normally for kind of lectures or other things, that's what I would recommend you keep this in. But today we really want to have a discussion. So Brooke has asked that we maybe keep it on grid view, which I think of as like Brady Bunch view. And the way you do that is if you go to the top right hand of your screen, you'll see what looks like a bunch of little squares together, and should say gallery view, excuse me, not grid view. Once you click on that, you should be able to see all of us in one screen. The nice thing I'll mention though is that we can't see your screen. You can pick whatever configuration you want it to be in. So if you want speaker view, maybe it's hard to see, you can do that. But for a discussion, it's really nice to see everybody here together. I'll also say for this, since there's gonna be a few of us on this call, if you wanna make sure you do see Brooke the entire time, you can pin her. So the way you do that is go to the top of her screen, and Brooke, wave for everybody to see you. You're there, you're at the top of my screen. So you click on what looks like 3 little dots. There'll be a drop-down menu, and then you click pin video. So that means even if we get quite a few people on the call and we have to go into 2 pages, you'll always see Brooke. That's one option as well. The other thing I'll mention is that Zoom likes to assume it knows who the speaker is. So one way to do that is I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody as the host. I'm going to go ahead and mute, and excuse me, I've got to make sure. Oh, no, sorry, I'm getting an internal error. So if I go away, I apologize, but hopefully I won't. So I just went ahead and muted everybody. And the reason for that is that if you have like a furry friend with you, like a cat, and you are not on mute, and your cat comes in, starts chatting, it's going to zoom over to you, or it'll be kind of confusing. There'll be a lot of auditory sounds. So we're going to ask that unless you're actively speaking, you stay on mute. That said, we want to hear from you. I'm not trying to say be quiet the whole time. Feel free to unmute yourself. And the way you do that is at the bottom of your screen, you'll see these 2 little icons. One looks like a microphone and one looks like a camera. So you can unmute yourself that way. And for your camera, if you'd like for us to be able to see you and we can't, you just click on that camera button, we will be able to see your icon. But if you're hanging out in your pajamas with your coffee and you don't want to be on camera, that's totally fine. I also mention that because we are recording today's event. It will be shared on our YouTube channel later today. So if you don't want to be on camera, that's one option. You can just listen passively and still be a part of the conversation that way. The other thing is, one way, since we can't see you in physical space in the same way, that we are going to ask people to raise their hands virtually. The way you do that is if you go to the bottom of your screen, there'll be a button that says participants. When you click on that, you'll be able to see a list of everyone's name, and at the bottom, in kind of a white button, it'll say raise hand. So if you do that, I and Brooke will be able to see your hand raised, and we will call on people that way. The other lovely option we have through Zoom is to chat. So if you'd rather write a question while this conversation is happening, you can definitely write it in the chat. If you want to share resources, we've gotten some amazing articles and links that people have put in the chat as well. This is definitely an option. The last thing I'll mention too is if anybody has any questions or any technical hiccups during this event or for future events, you can feel free to email me. And I used to have my little sign. I don't think I have it. Oh, here we go. So if you want to ask any questions, I'm here. for you. So without further ado, that's enough of me talking. I'd love to hand you over to our Culture and Coffee host, Edna S. Tuttleman, Director of the Museum at PAFA, Brooke Davis Anderson. Welcome, Brooke, and welcome all of you. Whoop, we gotta unmute Brooke.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Abby, thank you so much. It's always nice to see Abby's vista in the grid because we've decided she has the best brick wall in Philadelphia. So it's good to see so many faces, so many friends from here and beyond. Welcome to Culture and Coffee and happy holidays this week and this weekend. PAFA's really missing all of you. We really have been missing not only one another. I'm seeing a lot of the museum team on this Zoom conversation, but we're also missing our audiences and our supporters and our friends. And so it's vital that we have these opportunities with you together. And I'm thrilled to see so many lovely women this morning. I'm hoping too that everyone is in good health as we enter week something of self-isolation. I'm hoping that everybody's taking good care of themselves and staying close to home. We had a refrigerator breakdown in our house yesterday, and it led to this most epic conversation between my husband and me. We're a family of two, about what we were going to do and who and if we were going to let someone in the house. And we hadn't quite had this sort of situation yet in our lives. So I know that this is coming up for all of us in a lot of different ways. And then we can also just pause and recognize people who don't even have the option to be at home right now without homes. So one of the reasons why Abby and I wanted to keep the grid with Zoom is that this isn't a lecture, this is a conversation. So I know you're all paused for the moment, but I hope you're going to be raising your hands frequently and allowing us to invite you into the conversation. I have a feeling that all of us have an awful lot to say about women artists and supporting women artists and what their situation is working today and tomorrow. And we're going to try and get to both today and tomorrow. We thought it would be a great conversation to have because we've just sort of stepped away from Women's History Month. That's partially what was the impulse for this morning's talk. But also we wanted to have this conversation because the museum team, the curators, myself, our director of exhibitions, our registrar, we've all been spending an awful lot of time talking about our commitment to women through our exhibition program and our collection initiatives. And in fact, we have a plan that will be delayed by a few weeks, months because of COVID-19. But we've had a plan that we were going to be unrolling this summer of committing several years and of programs and exhibitions and publications and acquisitions, all the things that a museum can take on, and having all of those initiatives steer towards women artists, historically and contemporary artists. So we are still committed to that vision and those plans, and we're just pushing them out by a couple months in the hopes that I think we all share to be returning to our offices while we work remotely sometime in the summer months. So the good news is that initiative that we've been talking about at the PAFA Museum to really push women to the forefront of all of our work, and not to say that that's new to PAFA because it's not, and I'll get into that in a minute, but that deliberative plan for the next several years will continue, but it will have a start at a later time. And as you all know, what that later time is, we don't quite yet know. But I'm trusting that all of you will want to participate in that with us. And so I'm looking forward to all of you hanging around with us in Zoom and in person when we can do that. So before we talk about the situation now, which is where I'd like the bulk of the conversation to go, I just thought I would central the conversation around PAFA, which at PAFA always means looking back to our history as the first art museum and first art school in America. So let's consider that history for a minute, because it is stunning at a lot of moments in the 1800s especially. So PAFA was established in Philadelphia in 1805, and we opened as an art school and as an exhibition space. In 1810, the first president of PAFA invited 12 women to exhibit in an annual exhibition. The annual exhibition was the core function of the exhibition program at that time. It was the way in which we were building a collection to become a functioning museum. And of those 12 women who were invited in 1810, 10 of them accepted. So the first annual exhibition at PAFA included 10 female artists in 1811. I just think, knowing the global situation in 1810 and 11, that's quite extraordinary. As many of you know, I'm somewhat new to PAFA, so I've been surveying all of my colleagues who have a richer history at PAFA. What was it that the director of PAFA in 1810, Joseph Hopkinson, where was his impulse to open up the exhibition program and ultimately collecting program to women artists? And the response I most often get is that perhaps he was a Quaker, and that this was perhaps the reason. If anybody on this Zoom conversation has more insights there, we'd love to hear. So I'm going to skip forward a little, because we could spend the whole day talking about a 200 years history at PAFA, to 1878, when the school at PAFA, and again, we're both the art school and the museum, hired its first female faculty member in 1878. Before we even had the right to vote in this country, one art school was hiring women. I believe that the exhibition history of 1810 and this faculty appointment in 1878 are some of the first roles that women have played in art academies around the world. I think we did this before older art academies in Europe, which is also something that I'd love to know more about. So that's exhibiting artists and teaching artists. Well, what about patronage by women? Interestingly, we have a rich and long history of women supporting women at PAFA. And in 1879, there was a bequest from Mary Smith to establish a prize given to a woman artist during that annual exhibition. The exhibitions that are more similar to our biennials and triennials of the 21st century. So way back in 1879, we had this patronage. Now I'm going to really take a big, tall step, which I can do being 6'2", and leap into the 21st century to 2010. And so I'm going to go from those first impulses of PAFA and ask you all to join me in the current impulses at the museum at PAFA, to acknowledge and talk about how women being collected in the museum was really solidified in 2010 with a gift of 500 works of art from a important patron and artist and activist in Philadelphia, Linda Lee Alter, who, after researching many institutions, chose PAFA as the site for her collection that had been devoted to building a core collection of works by contemporary artists, women, female artists. And it was not soon after Linda Lee Alter's gift in 2010, which you can all investigate further on our website and in a publication called The Female Gaze, that the institution took a further financial leap into the marketplace around women in the arts with the establishment of an acquisitions fund just about 3 years later that allowed PAFA to really be deliberative and mission-based and pointed about the way it was acquiring art and building its collection. And I would really say that once Jody Throckmorton, our curator of contemporary art, Jody, raise your hand, who's in the Zoom conversation with us. It was really Jodi's arrival about 5 years ago. And certainly her arrival was, I think there was a lot of interest on your part, Jodi, to be a part of building a collection at the first art museum in America. So your arrival 5 years ago really pushed forward a further agenda of how we're collecting contemporary art. The results of all of that, Linda Lee Alter's gift in 2010, the establishment of an acquisitions fund, and Jodi's arrival 5 years ago, really ended up resulting in PAFA being the leader in acquisitions around the country by American art museums, focusing on female artists through all times, not just contemporary artists, but historical, modern, and contemporary artists. And it's this history, this short snapshot for a Zoom conversation, if you will, was articulated in press that I suspect most of you have seen, or certainly Abby included in her invitations to join us this morning, about 2 different articles in ArtNet and Artsy about the fact that while we have a perception as a community, as an art world community, that women artists are hot right now and that everybody's collecting female art, in fact, the statistic was a little more daunting and disappointing. And a survey of about 30 museums around the country of varying sizes, varying budgets, in varying cities and small cities, showed that actually overall only 11% of acquisition funds throughout museums were devoted to and allocated to women artists. So PAFA had a good outcome in that narrative, and that we were the leader with 58% of our acquisition funds going to collecting women artists. But the overall national trend wasn't the perception that we had. The perception, due to press, due to coverage, due to anecdotal evidence in the art market, was that women were being collected like never before. And interestingly, the same group that did this survey around women artists did a survey a few months earlier around African American art and found the same situation. That the anecdotal dialogue was that African American art was being collected significantly. It was quite a different statistic when you drove down into the metrics. So we've been collecting women about a little over 10% in American art museums in the last decade. That was the time period for which the survey was done. And what I wanted to have this conversation about is how do we grow that statistic together? I think we're almost all women on this call. I see a lot of professionals on this call. I see a lot of leaders and game changers on this call. How do we take that statistic and that survey, which was disappointing, how do we look at some success stories? DIA has a success story, PAFA has a success story, and are there ways to collectively replicate or reinvent new ways to make sure that we're supporting artists in the marketplace and supporting women in that marketplace? I'm a little concerned about having an optimistic conversation like that during a period of isolation, of a global virus, a pandemic, and COVID-19. Because we've seen before with 9/11, with most recently with 9/11, and then again in 2008, that in general, when there's an economic collapse, museums tend to retract and return to a more conventional foundation and return to roots that might often be conventional and might not often include supporting women and artists of color, for example. PAFA has different roots. We could point to our roots even in a retraction and argue that we have always been supporting women, always been supporting artists of color, and that that is our contracted reality. But I'm concerned about my colleagues and other museums around the country, how we are going to be able to assure that we are participating in a helpful way with the female artists in our many different communities. So that's sort of what I've been thinking a little bit about. I think Abby just, let me just bring up chats, shared some, thanks Abby, shared the ArtNet article that shows the statistical finding. I trust that most of you have seen that. It's an incredible report. The report led to a number of other articles that go take a deeper dive into this discourse. And I too am hoping that we can kind of take a deeper dive in our discourse this morning. Something, Jody, if I may tease you out for a minute, that we've been talking about in our curatorial sessions in the last couple of weeks as we've started to recognize the new situation we're all finding ourselves in and imagining what it's going to be like for the next couple of years, is we've talked about perhaps the priority and the impulse is to look locally, to hover in the local sphere of supporting women and our community of women nearby, whether that's Philly or Pennsylvania or Mid-Atlantic, is of course part of the conversation, but this idea of being able to really be influential and meaningful right here. Do you have anything you want to add about that this morning?
I mean, I think the thing that I've been thinking about is how we can, and we've talked a little bit about this, about how we can use this acquisition fund that we have to not only bring in the most wonderful art into the collection, but also to help feed our art community while we're all hurting. And that includes the galleries, the nonprofit spaces, and the artists. And I think that's how I've been thinking about our acquisitions going forward for the next year. A certain, I don't know what it will be. It'll be reaching out to the community and thinking about where there's need and where we can be of help. And it's also, I guess, maybe an opportunistic thing for us, because there's so much great art in the community. I mean, we buy a lot of local work anyway every year, which, I guess I don't think about as local, because we just put them all into the bin of great artists and great work to come in, which I think is important. But I think it's worth pointing out and focusing our efforts even more right now, looking right around us of who needs help and how we can actually support that. And that's certainly one of the ways.
And, our thinking was certainly enhanced when we heard that Anonymous Was a Woman, an amazing foundation that's a national foundation based in New York, decided to allocate $250,000 to emergency grants for women artists. And the emergency grants are gonna be in the number of about $2,500, which could pay a rent, provide a month's worth of expenses, could buy studio supplies, could do so many things for this period of time. And of course, that's dozens of women artists that this initiative is specifically targeted to. And it was kind of that announcement that I think got us thinking too, that even something modest like a couple $1,000s can actually be very impactful at this time. The thing that I've been hovering around, Jody, is that in the art world, when you think about sort of the mainstream art world, local is usually a bad word. Local is usually kind of hierarchical and a quality kind of conversation. And so the other thing that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is how to make sure that our colleagues in other places understand the great value of local, the great value of Philadelphia artists.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that and in some ways I think we've tried to do it, or how I've tried to think about it is by just not even calling the things, the exhibitions that we do, if it's with a local artist, I don't think about it that way or talk about it that way. And maybe that's something that we need to think about a way of showing that we're supporting these great artists in our community and that there are these great artists in our community. But not sort of, yeah, it's so funny how that word is, the local word is a pejorative kind of term in the art world, which makes no sense, right? We're not necessarily supporting these artists because they're local. We're supporting because they're great and they're in our own backyard. So
And
it's an interesting question.
Because there are a lot of, I say this with love because there are a lot of New Yorkers on the call, and I am also identify very much as a New Yorker, but New Yorkers are so good at making local New York. So you're a New York artist, you're not a local artist. So we just have to kind of somehow claim that phrase for outside of New York.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to, Brooke, we have a hand.
Yep.
I'm going to go to Paula.
Great.
So here I am. Yes, local is great, and also as a curator, I've always really focused on proposing the community that was right there, coming to see also what the museum is doing out in the world and making sure that the world knew about it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Another way for me as a curator to really make sure that the investment in the work of women artists was making an impact was to unpack what is in the work as much as possible, and to see how that work was, and to emphasize how that work was also impacting the institution. So for example, 10 years ago, I invited Liza Liu at the Cleveland Museum of Art. She was doing work with local communities in South Africa where she was living at that time. And the work was the result of just her interest in hiring those women and making the work with her. So I was bringing to the museum a form that was signifying pure work, and this idea. It was a beautiful piece. It is a beautiful piece made with beads, of course, but and somewhat abstract also, but it was for me most of all a way to speak to my audiences there about how an artist has a gigantic impact through these kind of by making the work and through the meaning of the work. So that when not only for me it has been important to bring in the voices, but then as a curator to really make it loud as possible. And we continue to do that, I think, at the Brodsky Center as well.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. Paula is a PAFA colleague and is our director of the Brodsky Center. And the Brodsky Center partners with the museum periodically. And we have a show up now that's currently closed due to COVID-19, but that will reopen when we reopen, that Paula guest curated for us. Any other hands? Abby, I'm not very skilled in that technique yet.
I don't see any yet, but I think Brooke, we have someone who's trying to raise their hand. Brooke, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Oh,
great. Thanks. Hi, Brooke. Hi, everyone. Brooke, I think a few things that I think what we're seeing in exhibition schedules of major museums and smaller institutions is that there is a significant attention now to showing the work of women artists in exhibitions, either monographically or through group shows. Oftentimes acquisitions come through a pipeline of not only purchases by an institution, but also gifts from donors. And that sometimes takes generational periods to have change and to have long-term impact. That's not in any way to excuse it, but that might be what we're seeing in the sort of pipeline of institutional acquisitions. And I also thought an amusing note was the survey you're referring to. This is the one by Art Agency Partners, right?
Yeah.
About women artists acquired by museum collections. Apparently, the matrix of the thing was such that Carol Dunham was initially included in this listing as a woman artist because his name is Carol. And as soon as he was removed, it went, it just crashed to be that 11%. So there was a blip of hope as they were reading initial statistics. And then when a human finally looked at it, yeah, things changed. So.
Oh, Brooke, I actually had never heard that. So that's incredible. And it reminds me of something that I'm sure many of you also saw. The same colleagues did a survey of, as I mentioned earlier, the history of acquiring African-American art and exhibiting African-American art for the last 10 years in about 30 American art museums, similar kind of framework. And they pointed out that when they took out exhibitions and acquisitions of Basquiat's artwork, it crashed to something like 0.5%. It went so drastically low once one artist who's at the top of a marketplace was removed from that. So yeah, that's really fascinating. I hadn't known that.
So what we think in the field is that those of us who can bring women artists into our exhibition schedules or into the commissions that we do, I mean, that is such significant work to have an impact in the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something else that I'm thinking about is the obligation we all have to support women artists. We work in an institution that has 300 art students, and it always fascinates me, and you all know this statistic, that women dominate student enrollment at art schools by more than half. So I think at PAFA, anybody can correct me, but I believe it's close to 70% female students at PAFA. And what's fascinating is the decline of visibility after art school for these women who are studying the program. And that's not just a PAFA statistic, that's I believe a national statistic. I think we have a question, Abby, from Elizabeth at Bennington.
So Elizabeth asks, could you talk about PAFA's involvement in the Feminist Art Coalition and collaboration across institutions?
Yes. So we've done a few partnerships, thanks Elizabeth, in our effort to build audiences and to also identify colleagues who are like-minded, because of course, partnerships are a way to strengthen everything that all of your mission. So your mission is to create an exhibition, get as many people as possible into an exhibition, to acquire art. Those partnerships help us do that. And before I bring up FAC, I thought I would bring up Pulse and Fontaine Press, which is a partnership that I think has in its own way been transformational for our collection. And it's a partnership that that was the idea of Pulse and Fontaine Press for our museum and another museum, but it's a partnership that could be replicated and answer a lot of the questions around collecting women and artists of color. The partnership between PAFA and Pulse and Fontaine Press was a gift and an acquisition. So it was shared both as a gift and an acquisition, which is something most museums can work toward. And we purchased, Jody, how many works from them through the gift and acquisition? The first, was it something like 70 works?
I think it was around 125.
We have Jennifer, our chief registrar, online too, who will probably know that answer better than anybody in the museum. But okay, so let's say it was 125 prints. All those prints were by artists of color. And it was an acquisition gift situation. And then we entered into a long-term relationship with Pulse and Fontaine Press to commit to purchasing future prints and to also advise them on artists that they could work with to make those prints, artists who would be, Jennifer just chimed in, it's 119, thank you, Jennifer. it takes a team. But what I like about that partnership is it shows that there can be shaping of a demographic in a permanent collection with a partner like a press. And I think that has a lot of potential for future and other institutions to replicate. And they found us, and they identified us, and they found a shared mission with us. And it's similar, Elizabeth, with the Feminist Art Coalition and also Vision 2020. I would point to both of those entities as partners for our 2-year or longer celebration of looking at women artists in exhibitions and collections. Our Vision 2020 relationship is a connection that we have here in Philadelphia with Drexel University. And I believe it was about 3 or 4 years ago that a number of women in Philadelphia started getting together to see how we could adequately honor the 100th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment, which is this summer. And they started pulling together like-minded institutions in Philadelphia. And now it's a national outreach. It started here, but it's grown. And when we learned about Vision 2020 just by word of mouth and listening carefully in the community, I very quickly reached out to them to partner, because at the same time, my team and I were talking about a large suite of programs around women in our exhibition planning. And so there was synchronicity, and the synchronicity is largely marketing. Like many museums, we have an intimate marketing team. And so the partnerships always prove to be more effective in spreading the word and getting new audiences and building audiences than without the partnership. So those partnerships, in my view, are largely mission-based sharing partnerships. We are like-minded, that's crucial. And then we tend to benefit most heartily from a marketing point of view, which is major. That's a major need that we have to get people to visit these projects. FAC is very similar for PAFA. The Feminist Art Coalition started by several women on the West Coast to empower us in our shared effort to promote women in the arts, and particularly artists. When we learned about it, Jody learned about it and shared the information with me. Again, it seems like I don't believe the group is meeting as a group yet. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I don't think we're convening as a body like we are today to talk about shared mission, to talk about shared values. But once we identified that FAC shared a value with PAFA, being committed to female artists, I saw that partnership too as being a very crucial feeder for marketing and promoting and sharing the work that we're doing at PAFA. Because PAFA is, Philadelphia is a second city, and it's very easy it is very easy for the mainstream art press to keep its eye on mainstream cities, New York and LA. When you live in a second city, you are spending enormous amount of your time making sure that you are seen. And FAC and Vision 2020 help us be seen by people like all of you, which helps our mission and also empowers us to keep going because we're supported by like-minded colleagues. And when I think about this period of time that we're in the middle of, where we can't be together, where I can't put my hand on the shoulder of any of my colleagues, where we can't sit across from each other at a table at work, being encouraged and supported is going to be more and more important. And being told that you guys are going in the right direction is going to be more and more important. And I would say that that kind of support is going to also be important when we see that the economy might take a while to rebuild, that resources might be a bit diminished for all of us on this call. So we are going to be needing to stand by each other in their commitment to women and artists of color. For me, they are one conversation. And FAC and Vision 2020 really can enable us to have that support system. I'd be curious, Elizabeth, I know your work so well. I'd be curious to know if there's any way that you're working with FAC or Vision 2020 with all of your commitments.
Not yet, but I would be curious to see if there are ways we could be. Thank you, Brooke.
Of course.
I believe we had a question from Susanna.
Yeah, so I'm a relative novice to the fine arts world. I come from archaeological museum space, which is framed a little bit differently. So I'd be really interested in hearing more about how some of the people in this conversation from different institutions are thinking about how to implement different strategies for incorporating more women artists. We've heard a lot about sort of the foundation that PAFA has, and that's really great. And I'm wondering how either PAFA builds on that or how other institutions either use some of those strategies or maybe come up with totally novel ones that make sense in a different context. That's open for anyone. I'm just here to learn.
Aisha?
Sure. Hi, how's everyone doing?
Hi.
Hi, Brooke, thank you so much for this. So, Susanna, to your question, of course, you're asking this question to all organizations. So I run a mid-sized to small to mid-sized nonprofit arts organization, 12 Gates Arts. We support American diaspora artists. So we already kind of specify in our field, like, you know, we are dealing with mostly artists from MENASA region, which is Middle Eastern, North Africa, and South Asia, and we are working with only artists of color, right? And mostly our curators are from Philadelphia, from New York, but they're mostly American diaspora as well. So when we started working, when we formed this organization, so we had a formula. Number one, I have two kind of challenges. I have to make sure I cover South Asia properly, right? So I am not just only concentrated towards only artists from Pakistan or India or Bangladesh or Nepal. Like, so there was one concern there. And then the other concern was how we bring South Asian women out, right? Because what was happening, India and Pakistan especially, and actually now Bangladesh, we have amazing three schools which are very they are into the miniature sculpture or like very contemporary art. But what all these artists, when they move to they come to United States, not necessarily they have visa, they can work because there's some kind of visa, and then all. So we were thinking how to work with them, like how to make that possible, that we have maximum women artist participation. It was challenging in the beginning, but you know, I have seen, so gallery organization has been around from last 10 years, right? So I have noticed things changed drastically in the last 7 to 8 years. I actually have no problem finding women artists now. And I have noticed it's because of social media. And it's because of, I think, I think social media women have more presence. They have kids, they're staying home, stayed mom artists. They have outlet to get out where organizations like ours, we can approach them, we can find their work. Otherwise, before that, it was a mission for me to dig for like women artists and from South Asia region, especially from Middle East. So that's what our formula is. So like if we are having a group show, we have to have half and half, and even women artists more. And if we are doing solos, we do lean towards more women artists. So we actually have a board who works on that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, that was fascinating. That gave me so much insight. I especially loved hearing about how social media sort of changed the game. And I wonder what that does in this moment when we all go online. Is that an opportunity for women artists, or are, you know, now then do men realize that they also can?
You just got muted, Susanna. Thank you for that. I did want to mention we are nearing the end of our time. Unfortunately, together we are almost to 11:15. So I wanted to maybe see if Brooke had any last last thoughts, and also just to thank all of you for coming. You know, we want to hear more from you. I, especially as a woman artist, I'm so happy that we're having this conversation. And I think as our world changes, as our domestic spheres change in ways, how we can support women creatively is going to be a challenge. So artists can continue to make work, and that institutions can support them. So it was so nice to hear from many of you, and we want to continue to have these conversations and hear back from you about what you want from these spheres too. Yeah.
So I think there are some artists, Abby, I keep forgetting because you're our educator at PAFA, that you are also a practicing artist, an alum of PAFA actually. What is it that you feel you need? And I'd love if there's some artists on this group. To me, that would be a great way to round out this conversation this morning by hearing from some artists telling us what the need is and maybe what it might be going forward. So Abby, when you think about this time that we're in with a pandemic, we've never gone through this before. All of us have never gone through this before. And you think about your practice, do you imagine it could change? Do you ever think, oh my God, I'm just not gonna be able to do it anymore? How do you feel?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this question a lot. I was just actually watching an artist talk or an author talk last week, and she was talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how we put all this pressure on ourselves to be creative, but if our other needs aren't met first, like if I need to make sure I can pay my rent, and which I can with this job, but you know, there's a lot of other things, thinking about my health and my family before I'm thinking about my creativity. And so I think in one space, I want outlets for conversation. I want understanding and empathy, and also, I think, you know, understanding that my practice might be interrupted in this, and then that's okay, because I think we've had this optimization of like, I'm going to make the most creative things. And so I do think community is what I need as an artist right now, first and foremost. But yeah, and I see a hand. I'd love to hear from other artists to how you are handling this. I'm going to unmute you. Yeah, just.
I had a discussion about this with a curator, and the reasoning behind why women artists are not as widely collected by collectors. And you know, one of the things is that she said is that women artists tend to be not as prolific of makers. And it's sort of this never-ending circle where women artists aren't purchased, and so there isn't the money to make more art, and so you can't make more art. And so it's this sort of self-perpetuating wheel that we're on. And I think artists of color have that same issue, as there's other groups of artists as well, is that, you know, and that's sort of held over women as, you know, you need to make more work so that we can purchase it, but then the funds aren't there to make the work. And so I think community is great. I mean, I think a lot of women are juggling many things, having families and having jobs. I think many women who are artists oftentimes have to support themselves. They might be a first generation artist in their family, and there isn't a lot of support, or they didn't feel a lot of push for success from either family or even their teachers within art school. I mean, I know some professors who are male who basically said, well, women, they just don't go out there and do it when they graduate. They just don't have a fire under them to do it. And not understand that there might not be a network to kind of help push them through as they're trying to do it, like there are for men. So it's a complicated question. I think there's a lot of people who'd like to get more women collections, but without women being purchased, the work being purchased and being given to museums as part of collections, it's really hard to kind of break that barrier. And I think a lot of women also have alternative practices that are maybe defy this idea of the material object that can be easily and readily acquired. So there's sort of, it requires a kind of a complete rethinking of what expectations are for artists in terms of output and the kind of work that an artist makes, like actually opening up our ideas of what kind of work artists make, so, and what constitutes art. And I think that's something that's really hard. It sort of requires a cultural shift, and that's a big task.
Yeah, you're so right. We're going to see things differently as women, and we're going to make things differently as women. We're going to lead differently as women, and we're going to collaborate differently as women. Abby, I appreciate you saying that what you will need is community. And if you don't mind, that's a nice segue to our gathering as the Culture and Coffee, the event that we're calling Culture and Coffee next Friday. Next to me on my Zoom screen is Paula. She's right there. And Paula is the guest curator of a project that's currently closed to the public, but that will hopefully, knock on wood, reopen, called Making Community, prints from Brandywine Workshop and Archive, Polson Fontaine Press, and Brodsky Center at PAFA. It highlights about 100 prints that are in our permanent collection by women and artists of color. And the whole premise of that show was really how the print workshops rely on community and partnerships to be productive. What Paula and I are going to do next week during this time, and we hope you'll consider joining us, is we're going to look at some artists in that show, not the print workshop so much, but really how artists teased out community for themselves with several of the artists in that exhibition. And I think it'll be a really neat conversation to talk about the need of gathering and knowing one another for several of the artists in making community. So that'll be next. I know Abby has worked an incredible menu of programming for the next week, which you can all find on our website, I believe. I just want to thank you before she does and closes us out. Thank you so much for giving PAFA some of your time this morning. And I hope to see you again this way and in real time soon. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, take care. We'll see you soon.
Okay.